computer's working. Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here for my presentation. And my name is Yewon Kang. I'm a PhD student in the Department of Educational Psychology at the University of Minnesota. And I'll be presenting the research that explores the influence of linguistic forms in headlines on click and share intentions. And this is the project that I've been working on with Tori, Didi, and Tani. And since Tori's here, please feel free to interrupt me if there's anything you'd like to add, Tori. All right, let's get started. As you all know, misinformation is often spread through headlines on social media. And as many of you may have experienced, people tend to share headlines without even reading the full articles. Therefore, headlines have been extensively studied in the context of misinformation research. However, specific linguistic aspects of headlines have received relatively little attention. So by examining the linguistic aspects of headlines, we thought we would gain a deeper understanding of how misinformation spreads and what we can do to combat it. To incorporate linguistic aspects into our research, we first focused on clickbait headlines. So clickbait are headlines that are intentionally designed to attract more clicks. And studies have shown that clickbait headlines have the potential to spread misinformation. And clickbait headlines can use various linguistic features. So for instance, they may include referencing expressions such as "this is why" or "do this now." Or it can also pose questions like, did Michael J. Fox die? And like, how many times will you get COVID? Like this. And after identifying the use of linguistic forms such as questions as clickbait, we decided to manipulate speech acts in order to create diverse linguistic forms in headlines. And speech act refer to the communicative acts that convey intended messages. One example of a speech act is the assertive speech act, in which speakers present information that they believe to be true without necessarily expecting any action from the audience. So as you can see in the following headline, here CDC put much of Minnesota at low risk of COVID this week. This headline conveys information about the current COVID risk in Minnesota without requiring any action or further information. In contrast to the assertive speech act, interrogative speech act involve speakers seeking information from the audience, and it's the audience's responsibility to respond or admit ignorance. So for instance, if you look at this headline below, how many times will you get COVID? Because the headline lacks specific information, it creates a sense of curiosity and information gaps that may prompt readers to click the article in order to find out the answer. In other words, headlines that lack sufficient information can create a gap between the headline and the full article, which can induce a feeling of cognitive deprivation in readers, and also which can be satisfied or alleviated by actually clicking through the articles. Indeed, one study found that questions in headlines can lead to more clicks than a statement. And this leads us to our first hypothesis that people will be more inclined to click on interrogative headlines than assertive headlines. In contrast, when it comes to sharing, we speculated that headlines with information gaps or gap-inducing properties may not be as widely shared. This is because many people, as I mentioned earlier, many people tend to share headlines without reading the full article, and people are also more likely to share information they believe to be accurate. So we thought headlines that present explicit and concrete information in a clear and informative format may be more likely to be shared. And this brings us to our second hypothesis, that people will be more inclined to share assertive headlines than interrogative headlines. So in our current experiment, we aim to explore the impact of different linguistic forms, including assertive, interrogative, and combined, which is a combination of both, on the intent to click and share. I'll be elaborating on each of these forms later in this presentation. So moving on now for our method. And here in our experiment, we recruited 530 participants from across the United States through Prolific. And we used 36 COVID-19 related headlines adapted from Penny Cook et al. Study. And here, half of them were true and half of them were false. And we employed a within subject manipulation where each participant saw all 36 headlines. And as I previously mentioned, each was manipulated into one of the 9 linguistic forms here. And these forms were largely categorized into 3 groups: assertive, interrogative, and combined. And the subcategories are manipulated based on the expertise of Professor Didi Bahadra from Institute of Linguistics. So starting with the assertive category, we included 3 subcategories: baseline assertion, and assertion with reveal, and concessive continuation. So the assertion headline simply presents information such as American incomes were rising until the pandemic hit. And the assertion with reveal subcategory provides additional details with the because clause. So as you can see in this example, American incomes were rising until the pandemic hit because the pandemic raised the unemployment rate. And the concessive continuation, on the other hand, presents explicit information like the assertion with reveal, but with a contrast to the assertion. So such as American income, so economic growth was low, but American incomes were rising until the pandemic hit, like this. All right. Now moving on to the interrogative category, there are rising declarative in WH question, polar question, and polar alternative question. First, the rising declarative form is a statement that ends with a question mark. So basically it's the same as the assertion, but with a question mark, like American incomes were rising until the pandemic hit, question mark. And then the WH question form uses question words like why, when, and how. And here we use why, as in why were American incomes were rising until the pandemic hit. And then the polar question form uses yes, no words like, as you know, do, did, is, are, something like that. And here, the polar question was, were American incomes rising until the pandemic hit? And then finally, the polar alternative question adds a sense of urgency by including or not at the end of the headline, such as were American incomes rising until the pandemic hit or not? All right. Now, finally, in the combined category, we have 2 subcategories: WH question with reveal and conditional with WH consequent. The first one, WH question with reveal, creates an information gap, as we discussed earlier, but the following because clause provides the necessary information to close the gap. And the conditional with WH consequent On the other hand, it combines two clauses. So it starts with an assertion with the if clause and then followed by a question. So this makes this can make it the opposite of the WH question with reveal speech act in terms of structure and function. All right, then to assess the participants' intention to click and share each headline, we asked two questions on the same page. So like if it was possible, would you click on this headline to read the full story? And if you were to see the above article online, would you share it? So participants have to indicate either yes or no to each question. And then for our analysis, we employed binomial logistic regression models to determine the variables that influence participants' intent to click and share the headlines. To account for repeated measures of different items, we included participants and headlines as random effects in our analysis. We also designated those who responded no to the clicking and sharing intention questions as our reference group, as well as the statements being true in the linguistic form category of assertive or base assertion. Now moving on to our results. And as I said, we used the assertive category as our reference group. So we compare that to other categories. So the results showed that participants were more likely to click on assertive headlines compared to interrogative and combined headlines, which means our hypothesis was not supported here. And also whether the headline was true or false was not a significant predictor of clicking. However, the three category analysis doesn't tell the whole story. It's more complicated than that, which makes sense because each speech act works differently. And based on our additional analysis with 9 subcategories compared to the base assertion headline, people were less likely to click on assertion with reveal, rising declarative, polar question, and polar alternate question, and all the combined ones. But they were just as likely to click on concessive continuation and WH question headlines as they were on the base assertion headlines. So in summary, the 6 subcategories highlighted in yellow here were less likely to elicit clicks compared to the base assertion category. Okay, now sharing. The people were more likely to share assertive headlines than the interrogative and combined headlines, which is the same pattern that we saw for clicking. But this time, our hypothesis was supported. And also, whether the headline was true or false was not a significant predictor of sharing as well. And just like clicking, sharing was also more complicated than we initially thought when we look at these 9 category analysis. And this showed that people were less likely to share polar questions and polar alternative questions in the 2 in the combined category than base assertion headlines. The rest were just as likely to be shared as the base assertion headlines. So in this table, there's 4 subcategories highlighted in yellow were less likely to elicit shares compared to the base assertion category, right? Now let's all sum up what we've discussed so far. And the key takeaway, I believe, is that the linguistic form of headlines was a significant predictor of participants' clicking and sharing intentions. And in general, when we just look at the 3 category analysis, people were more inclined to click and share assertive headlines compared to interrogative and combined headlines. However, the relationship between the linguistic forms of headlines. Oh, my computer, sorry. Sorry about that. So I'll start here. However, the relationship between linguistic forms of headlines and clicking and sharing intentions was not as simple as we initially thought when we look at the 9-category analysis. So there's, to be honest, there is still much to explore and interpret, and we'd love to hear your thoughts or feedback later. And now let me just summarize our results. And first, our research showed that these two polar questions and two combined headlines were less appealing than base assertion headlines for both clicking and sharing intentions. And then next, we found that assertion with reveals and rising declaratives were less appealing for clicking than base assertion headlines, but not for sharing. So people were less inclined to click these two compared to the assertion headline. And additionally, our analysis showed that concessive continuations and WH questions were equally appealing to the base assertion headlines for both clicking and sharing. And finally, I think it's also worth noting that the truthfulness or accuracy of the headlines did not significantly affect participants' clicking and sharing behavior. This finding is actually consistent with previous research suggesting that people may not always evaluate the accuracy of headlines automatically. And it's also important to consider that adding the task of indicating their intent to share may also reduce participants' accuracy judgment. So I thought these are the possible explanations. But there are some limitations to our study that should be taken into consideration. For instance, potential interactions between answering, clicking, and sharing questions may have influenced our result because we presented both questions on the same page. So to address this, our next experiment will separate the clicking and sharing questions to better understand participants' intentions. And additionally, the small number of headlines used in our study may limit the generalizability of our findings. So I am currently conducting a larger scale computational study using real headline data to explore whether real headlines follow the same pattern as we found in this study. And finally, our sample was pretty diverse. So I think future research could focus on specific populations, such as the aging population. In conclusion, our research suggests that linguistic forms of headlines should be considered in the study of misinformation spread, and we hope to provide a foundation for developing interventions for reducing misinformation and eventually ensuring public health. Thank you. And do you have any questions or comments?
I was curious about the effects of the length of the headlines. I mean, obviously, some of the forms are going to be longer than others. Have you considered the possibility that that could be having an effect and perhaps complicating your interpretation of the results?
Yeah, that's a good point. And we actually have looked at the length of the headlines. Yeah, and so we thought people would share or click, people will be more interested in shorter headlines, considering users intend to like quickly go through the headlines in the online environment, but there was no significant effect of length when we looked at the length of the headline. So maybe there's more than that, but maybe we need to look more deeply into that. But yeah, I think, yeah. Yeah.
I was also really curious about your truth variable. I mean, in a sense, it really doesn't matter whether it's true or not. What matters is whether the person believes it's true. And do you have any plans for trying to flesh that out?
Oh, yeah, that's also another good point. And right, so maybe I think there are some previous studies that focused on the accuracy of headlines and accuracy judgment of participants. But
Yeah.
if I
We
remember,
also,
yeah.
yeah, we also did pretest for things like familiarity and believability. So all of that we do have numbers for as well. And in general, there's a bit of difference in the like believability between the true and false items, but not a lot.
Well, that's kind of depressing.
Yeah, yeah.
And I mean, there are a couple of ways that that could happen. And one, which is particularly interesting, is that you've got basically a bimodal sample where some people have bought into a lot of misinformation and some people haven't. Is there any way you could try to flesh that out and see to what extent that's playing a role?
Do you mean like recruiting participants from the group that are more exposed, that is more exposed to misinformation?
What I was thinking is,
We
go ahead.
Yeah, we did measure political ideology. So we do have that to look at as well as demographic factors like age, gender, race, and ethnicity, and level of education. So we haven't looked at those specifically besides just getting an overall idea of our category right now, just because of all the complicatedness of the variables. To account for that would be really hard just with, we don't have enough participants for that right now. But that's definitely an area that we're hoping to move toward.
I think that could be really interesting.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, along those lines, what Randy was saying and what you're, Tori, what you're alluding to, I think the whole, you're basically looking at direct and indirect speech acts and trying to unpack what people interpret these forms as. So just as a FYI, as you start out, be very clear and careful to differentiate, between the linguistic form and the speech act, so that it's clear what's your form and what you assume this does as a speech act. And you're making assumptions about the speech acts you have to at this point. And depending on all these demographic background factors, people will make different interpretations of these forms. So it's a huge task, but one of the first things I think you want to look at is some of the major categories. What are the speech acts? Why are people reading this stuff? Why are they clicking on it? Why are they sharing it? So what speech acts do they in their minds actually engage in, so that you're not making an assumption on their behalf, but rather really know what's going on for them. And I think that will start helping as you factor this out, have larger numbers, figure out what certain backgrounds, why they're on the net. I mean, I know some people who are just, they're there for the social, like, okay, I'm in the know, I'm part of a group, I want to be, recognized. That has nothing to do with the information. That's all very much social or psychosocial. And other people are maybe more after the information content itself. But there's a million things, people might engage in these activities and read these headlines. It's great stuff. I love this study and this material. It's so important. And so from the get-go, be clear about, first of all, what your forms are, and then get a sense of what the speech acts, the common speech acts might be that people think there are actually reading, because there's no way of knowing whether the interrogative is actually really going to be a question in people's minds, or if they already read this as a call to action. It's like, okay, the world's uncertain, we got to go to the Capitol and storm it or whatever. I mean, it's crazy what happens. Okay, but yeah, that I think that's, as Randy was already suggesting too, that those are sort of your next steps, so that you're getting out of the driver's seat really in terms of the interpretation, the speech acts that are being conveyed, and have more of a sense of what people really are thinking, they're understanding or sharing, or why they're doing that sharing, and even clicking to begin with.
Yeah, that's right. Hopefully this is just the first step, and the mechanism behind why people choose to click and or share content would be our next step. Yeah, thank you.
I think the big thing, what led to this, was Dee Dee going, we haven't been thinking about misinformation research, like the linguistic forms of it, enough in here. So this was kind of the first step of, is there something there? And it looks like there is something. So now trying to dive that deeper into that going forward. And we do also have social media use demographic variables as well that we have information on that just haven't really fully explored there as well.
Is there a literature in journalism on headlines and the impact of headlines and the things that make for good, impactful headlines?
There should be, right?
I would think so.
You think so, right? Yeah.
Yeah. We'll have to definitely look into that. I think it's definitely not been connected with a lot of the current misinformation research, which is kind of a thing that the field in general in that field is saying, is that they're not connecting enough to a lot of the historical fields and backgrounds. So definitely a thing we'll have to look at.
They may have done some of the work for you, or at least have some suggestions that you could pursue.
Right, and that's actually connected to something I was wondering too. So the samples that you're working with, you made up, right? That they're not pulled from the web, the headlines. Is that correct?
They are real headlines.
They
are real. They were mostly in an assertive form to begin with, but we then put them into all of the categories. They were real headlines taken from an earlier study by Pennycook and al., which are prominent misinformation researchers, because of the fact we wanted it to be comparable to some of the other misinformation studies out there.
Because they seem just intuitively more complex, some of them, as you expanded them. I've been just for linguistic practice, had my linguistic students analyze the syntax of headlines, and I only work with 6 or 7 of them. They're fairly short. They delete articles. They're mostly just in statement form and assertion forms. So that might be something good to look into in corpora, maybe. Just even there must be data from newspaper headlines, or I don't know if newspapers really the measurement, but whatever whatever population, whatever they read those kinds of headlines, you might get some of that from corpora as well.
Yeah, I think Yewan's looking at that right now.
Okay, because they're often very impoverished. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks to Laura here. I found the headline data with over 1 million headlines. So I'm currently categorizing those headlines into different categories, different linguistic form categories. And if that works, and if I could find a similar pattern with that data as well, then probably I could be more confident about the validity of of this finding. Yeah.
That's great. And keep tracking as well what the source was, so that you have a sense of who the target audience might have been, since you are behind what you're after is intended meaning, indirect speech acts. It's all about the audiences communicating and what their reasons for communication might be, so that you don't have to go back and redo that. So the more information you can track along with those headlines, the better. Yeah. But it's great stuff. It's fascinating.
Thank you.
Yeah, Yewan, when Andreas mentioned like getting kind of information about how participants are perceiving these headlines as like the kind of communications they're conveying or the speech acts that they're looking for, I think that might actually be helpful information for you to help with the categorizing of this corpus. Like, 'cause even one, like a similar syntax, depending on the context, could be interpreted as a like having a different purpose or meaning. And so if you kind of get like this middle ground between the linguistic form and how people perceive the linguistic form, that might give you some insight into like other categories that would be important to keep track of. So I think there's a lot of great work to be done in this area, and I'm excited to know more about it.
Yeah, thank you, Ali. That's a good point. And also, as I said in the presentation, there not just questions, but there are like other linguistic features that were designed to just attract users to clicks. Like, as I said, for like referencing expressions, like this is something, or there could be like here is something you want to read. So these kind of features could also be used as clickbait and used to spread misinformation. So yeah, there are a lot more to study. Yeah.
And just since Jeanette was at some point part of this group, when you mentioned this and referencing expressions, might be helpful. Look at her givenness hierarchy, just what kinds of forms people use and how given that information is or is not, and honor her work that way as well, since she's still with us that way. Yeah.
Do you, I'm not actually very familiar with that. Would you mind giving us some more information about the hierarchy that you mentioned?
The idea is basically that there are lots of different ways that you can refer to something. You could, I mean, sometimes you can use completely, I mean, you can just tell from context what somebody's talking about, so you're not saying it all. Or you could use a pronoun, or you could use their first name, you could use their full name, you could use their title in their first name. So that's basically the underlying issue. I mean, so how much information is given by the form that you use? Is that a reasonable description, Andreas?
Definitely. Just this and that, when you say this picture versus that picture, or when you say I painted a picture versus I painted the picture. I mean, all those determiners, all that makes a difference in terms of how given it is. You know, a picture could be any picture, the picture, it's given for the people talking to each other. Which picture that is, that's a really good example of givenness. You know, so the picture is given to the two people talking and is not given much at all. And you can find the givenness hierarchy easily enough. It was in language, and I was her student when it came out in the 90s, I guess. It must have been, or maybe early 80s, late 80s, early 90s. Yeah. If you can't find it, I'll help you, but it should be easy to find. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
One question I had was, and I'm sorry if I missed this, but what topics were the headlines that you gave them about? Were they all like COVID related, or?
Yeah, they were all COVID related headlines. Yeah.
I see. Okay. I was just curious about, like, in addition to like the kind of ideologies that people bring with them to these kinds of like activities, like how the topic itself might affect how people interpret various things. Like if somebody asked me, like, does a snake have 88 bones? Like, I don't know if a snake has 88 bones. So if you told me also snakes have 88 bones, like I don't know if, you know, saying do snakes have 88 bones would have the same effect as if somebody said, like, does COVID cause, you know, whatever it was, like your armpits to smell bad or whatever. Like it would have a very like different response. So yeah. How do you think these different like questions might depend or might lead to different like interpretations of the different speech forms?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. So maybe the interest in the topic would definitely affect their intentions to click and share. And actually, I personally think that the headlines we used are not very appealing. It's more of an informative. So maybe we could use some headlines with more like interesting, not interesting, but like maybe interesting topics, fun topics, and the results could be different. Yeah, that'd be interesting.
And that's again connected to the earlier suggestion that matters, why people engage, why they're even there to read. Are they reading for understanding information? Are they reading because they have an agenda to push? And so depending on your topic, yeah, it's a big one, definitely. So that's great. Yeah, it's important.
Yeah, I feel like one thing, we kind of started talking about this yesterday, so sorry, but I think it's really cool that you're bringing in this like speech act linguistic form stuff, because I don't know how much you know about the work, but there's a little bit of computer science work trying to use linguistic properties to predict clickbait in headlines. But that stuff is mostly, I mean, we've talked about this in class, but it's mostly very atheoretical. So it's just kind of like, here's what I can analyze about a headline. So it's not really like related to anything, but they do seem to have some interesting things that you could draw on. Like they've looked at sentiment, but also things like, I have this memory that like ellipses are weirdly strongly associated with clickbait, which kind of makes sense. But I bring all this up to say, I think one of the big things to think about as you sort of expand is, in what you had, they were all like could be true or false. But I think in this naturalistic data set that you have, it seems to be like there's different profiles of headline types that I wonder if you could, like as a future direction, if could be really interesting to sort of like come up with different types of headlines, as opposed to just saying like, here's a feature that always relates or doesn't relate to sharing in this sort of linear way. But maybe it's like, there are headlines that are more descriptive, like here's a list of some things, right? Like we talked about, like, here's the top 15 summer vacations or whatever. But then there's like, you know, people stormed the Capitol. And those are very different sorts of like, did something happen right now? Are you describing the state of the world? Are you giving me recommendations? Because those can't neatly be like true or false. There's sort of these like descriptive opinion-based things. Anyway, I'm just wondering if maybe thinking about like a profile type of analysis might be a useful direction and get at that functional aspect a bit. Anyway, I don't think this ended up in a question. Sorry, I meant to, but I don't know what happened. Lost myself.
Yeah, but that's a good point, because like I just said, I think like the headline like top 15 vacation spots, something like that could be more interesting than just posing questions. So yeah, since I have a million headlines, then there's more to discover. Yeah.
Just to make sure I'm understanding your question correctly, Laura. So I was thinking about it, but like are profiles of headlines like different from just like clusters of features, or like are those the same thing, or are they different?
Oh, no. It would be like clusters of features. So
Oh.
yeah, like, could you say like some of them are really emotional, and they also seem to have like this very like different type of syntactic structure and different types of, you know, versus other types that are more like statements of fact, where they're basically a sentence, you know.
I see. Yeah, that makes
Declares
sense.
that he is, whatever, you know. So yeah, I was thinking like, instead of viewing the linguistic things as like these very separable things, but seeing how they sort of like go together, and there's different, yeah, clusters of headline types, and how the linguistics like play out differently. In those. Anyway.
That makes sense. Could the what is it? The combined assertive and interrogative together, where you ask the question and answered in the headline, made it so that nobody really wanted to click on it, which makes sense because even if you're like, oh, I wonder what that is, the answer is in the headline, so there's no reason to click on it. So yeah, that makes sense. I'm sure there are more combinations like that.
I don't know if other people are on campus, but there sounds like there's like some dogs, like I'm so distracted, but it sounds like there's like a dog pound next to me in my office. So many dogs are barking. I don't think y'all can hear it probably too much.
Yeah, I
not-
cannot hear any.
Concerning. I'm like, what's going on?
I think Nidhi brought in her dog.
Well, it's not getting along with someone else's dog.
Oh,
I don't know. Anyway, that's
Oh,
another.
I just heard it. I just
Oh,
heard
you
it.
did?
Yeah, I don't think I would have noticed if you hadn't mentioned it.
It's very,
Sounds like a smallish dog.
yeah, it does. They sound like not, yeah, they're not scary. Anyway, I'm very sorry. I went away from the actual question.
Another thing related to linguistic forms that could be interesting to look at. And that's the use of like code words, dog whistle kinds of forms. Like I, for example, will probably not click on anything that uses headline that has the word groomer in it, but there are other people that I know who would be all over that. So there are certain, and another example that has to do with linguistic form is like using the word Democrat in place of democratic. I mean, that's a code word that tells you a lot about the orientation of the article and who and how likely it is to appeal to you and reinforce your pre-existing beliefs.
Woke is a good one, right?
Yep.
That's a dog whistle. Yeah.
Maybe I'm not familiar with the American politics, so there is a difference between Democrats and Democratic.
Using, if you say the Democrat senator from Minnesota instead of the Democratic senator from Minnesota, I mean that's something that for decades certain conservative politicians have used to try. I mean, it's on the one hand, it's not correct, but it's supposed to somehow diminish somebody to call them a Democrat politician instead of a Democratic politician. It's like it's become very much a dog whistle. I mean, you
Yeah.
will never hear Marjorie Taylor Greene use the word Democratic.
I see. Interesting.
And that word woke is in that vein as well right now. It's in vogue. That's
It
a
means very
that's a
different
negative.
things to different
Yeah.
politicians and
Yeah.
different audiences.
And of course, very ironic that it started in the Black community as a
Mhm.
self-identifying value type term, and now it's gotten totally turned around and now is a dog whistle for anything negatively connected with the Democratic Party and liberal and on and on. I don't know how far you want to go. So yeah, these terms are huge.
I wonder if this kind of relates, Yohan, to your interest in looking at age differences as well, because I hadn't even noticed that Democratic difference. Maybe it's because it was already like well in use by the time I was paying attention to the news or what, but yeah.
Yeah, you're right. We kind of looked at the how age affects this clicking and sharing intentions. And if I remember correctly, people who were 65 or older indicated their sharing intention more than others. So they basically wanted to share more
That's
headlines than
consistent
others.
with my relatives.
Yeah.
The older ones are the ones who feel compelled to share everything that they
Absolutely.
read.
Same here. Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, so I want to look into more like aging population in my future study as well.
And
But
you
I
can,
think you're really onto something here. I think this is a direction of research that could keep you busy for a long time.
by a whole career, yeah. Though it looks, yeah, and I think that you can correlate the age then with the advent of the internet and computer literacy and on and on. You know, when you look back, those people were 65, 70. I mean, they were not raised with computers. They learned it on the back of the.
I just forgot to say it, but one way that I could see this going in the future too is there's like a lot of old, work in cognitive science on how like a title can influence processing of information and thinking about like these different manipulations of how like closely related, how much it provides the global context, like all these different sorts of things of what does a headline do from a like processing perspective? How does it change what people attend to in the, like, if you then get them to read the text or, or if it's like really biased. You take that even more extreme and be like someone's tweet about a text, and here's the headline, and then how misaligned are they critiquing it? Or are they sort of, how does that prior context impact your processing? Anyway, just a random thought I had while you were talking.
No, that's a good point. Yeah, that'd be interesting. Yeah, I might have to, look for a lot of more articles after this.
I've always thought it was weird and even a little unfair that journalists typically don't get to choose their own headlines, that there's an editor who slaps a headline on the article for them.
That is interesting. Is that like does that vary by publication? Like where you were saying it's all usually, or I didn't know.
I know that at least some publications, that's the case. Whether it's all of them or it varies, like from newspapers to magazines to online websites. I really don't know.
Because I would be curious about but I don't know how you would ever get this data set unless you knew the rules, but it would be very interesting to see how well, author generated headlines map onto what they're saying compared to the, the ones that were created by the editor, the whatever what word I'm saying, the publishing company or whoever it is. That would be
I actually used to know somebody who literally had the job of writing headlines for the National Enquirer, which is, I think, a big time supermarket tabloid. And I always thought, my God, what a fun job. Picking up all these headlines for stories about aliens getting movie stars pregnant and things like that.
I want to read this person's memoirs. What's your life like? What is happening? Wow.
But there's a lot going on. I was just looking at the guidelines for a journal I want to send an article to, and they were very explicit about not to make the headlines too long. And so there was sort of this implicit directive that they will cut it short if you don't, kind of. So there's definitely a lot of regulation or whatever you want to call it around those. Yeah. So Randy's suggestion, has, I think, layers as well in terms of who calls the shots and when that is implemented and who decides. Yeah.
I mean, when it comes to titles on academic articles, that certainly is something that has always been into the control of the authors. I had not previously heard of journals trying to intervene in that. And I also have to say, I've always been kind of jealous of people who write good headlines. One of the best at that was a psychologist from UC San Diego named Jean Mandler. And she had an article called A Code in the Node and another one called Remembrance of Things Parsed, about memory for stories. And I just love those.
That's great. I think Liz Bates was pretty good about honing things to a line or so.
Yeah.
Hit hormones that way, yeah. I remember one of hers and that stuck with me. So yeah, like language is a low dimensional medium for a high dimensional task. It's like, wow, that says it right there. That's what you're after. That's the indirect speech act, it's the direct speech act. And what do people mean and want to say? And yeah.
She was brilliant.
Yeah, she was amazing.
This makes me like, I didn't really think hard about this before, but like making headlines or like headlines are like really special communicative like things. I wonder like how much of like these findings are specific to headlines, and I guess like more generally like what makes headlines special, like what are their functions and stuff like that. I don't really know much about the background on that, but does anyone know more about it?
One thing I will say is it's interesting how much the misinformation literature itself is really focused on headlines. Like the amount of research coming out of that field that is just focused on headlines is crazy, because both everything's social media focused and almost everything within social media focus is on headlines. So the fact that like most of the literature coming out from the field is all focused on this one very specific type of information is fascinating. Of how did we get there? Why are we focusing on this? Are questions I don't really know, but it's definitely something that that group in particular has really fixated on.
See, I
Yeah,
have heard like the people saying that like headlines have become more and more like sensational just because of the way the internet works. They put the ads on each page, so they're just trying to get you to click on stuff or whatever. But yeah, aside from that and like the work like you were saying, Tori, I don't know much else.
And also this kind of discussion makes me think about the negative impact of this kind of study, because I could provide some information for like editing or like news companies, and they might create some headline just to attract clicks and with misinformation. Yeah, so I think that's also something to think about.
I've been wondering this for a while, is whether or not they have algorithms or rules, or whether or not they're automated or not. It's irrelevant, I guess, but whether or not they do use this like clickbait research and then say, well, how can we make clickbait? What are the ways to sort of do it? Anyway, I don't know.
Yeah,
I'm
my
sure
hunch
they
would be
do.
that it's out there, yeah, and that you will inform the pushback against the bad clicking and sharing by guiding it into a positive and productive direction. But in general, I think there's a long tradition, and I'm trying to remember if I read something about this, but I think headlines have been compared to signposts, and you know, you have the signposts in front of stores and inns and restaurants. I mean, it's a long tradition, and so I think there must be something in the literature, maybe even in anthropology. I'm not sure where, around that, because the humanity has needed kind of placative. Here's where you need to go kind of information for a long time to find, like I said, food and accommodations.
Yeah, which like
I
the
just-
connection to signs makes me think also of how we normally see headlines, which is like we get on a news site, New York Times or wherever, and there's 30 headlines. And how do you sort of like, which one is salient, you know, like perceptually, and what are the ways that some of that's linguistic, but some of it's like font size and capitalization or whatever, like all those all caps ones, you know, just and the big, really big, all caps, you know, like this is a big deal. But anyway.
So I just Googled writing headlines and my God, you get a lot of hits.
Yeah, and the yellow press is called yellow press, you know, for that reason too. The color is important too.